first met Rav Yitz when I was 19. I had just finished 2 years in the Gush, and they were foundational years, partly because of that guy over there. But I also left actually still very confused, because I hadn't yet found a model of authentic, intelligent, ethical Jewish living. And I was lucky enough that summer, and I got an internship with Rav Yitz, and really his teachings have influenced my life. He was my Masader Kedushin. He held my son at his bris. So it's uniquely wonderful to be here at this moment. Not only did I find the Rebbe 25 years ago, but I found a drawer of partially finished manuscripts. Because if you know Yitz, you know he has a lot of ideas for books he wants to write, and he starts all of them. And so in this drawer, I find, it was handwritten on loose leaf paper, and I said, what is this? And he said, oh, that's a manuscript I started in 1969 for a class he was teaching on the history of Musar at YU. And I said, that's amazing. Like, Yitz translate. What was this work? It was this translation of Ohr Yisrael, or at least the very first draft of it. 14 years later, 2013, Sefaria started. We were adding translations of traditional texts. I went to Rav Yitz and I said, give me the manuscript. We're going to work it. We're going to push that. And he said the worst thing he possibly could have said. I'm planning to work on it next year. Right? But luckily, he did, with huge thanks to Justin, who helped him work on this. They were able to finish the manuscript, and it's a huge pleasure to be able to publish it with Koren and Sefaria. A huge thank you to Ellie Fisher, who's here, who helped edit the volume. And to Sender Cohen, who's not here, who sponsored the volume also. So that's it. I'm going to leave it to you guys now to take it away. But really special to be here, and thank you all for coming.
Great. There's so many other people I really have to thank. I guess part of it is the partners of JJGI Institute, the institute which underwrote really this work and other work I've been doing for the last 3 years. Sender Cohen, who, as you heard, he's one of the partners in the institute, but he's also personally underwrote the book and dedicated to the memory of his father, Professor Getzel Cohen. I'm grateful to Cohen. It's funny, I took them for granted, but the truth is that the original version, the one that I studied of Ohr Yisrael, the first time I read that book was 1954. So it's, what does that make it? It's like 70 years ago. But I had this edition. In fact, Rabbi Benny Lau, when he came tonight, pulled out the edition that he used and he studied in his yeshiva. That was the original edition. It has no dots. It has various typo errors. It's much more difficult to read. And this is a beautiful piece of work and very easy to read. So I thank Corin for that. What excites me is not just the publication, but the fact that it becomes part of Sefaria, because I really think that thereby it becomes part of the National Library of the Jewish people, of its heritage from the beginning. And that, to me, is something very important. In fact, the future of our own religious development is heavily dependent on, I believe, calling the whole resources of the tradition, the biblical, the rabbinic, the Kabbalistic, the Hasidic, and I think Musa is another example of a whole treasure of a stream that it won't appeal to everybody, but could be a very meaningful part of the rainbow Jewish tradition. So again, thanks you all. Now, having filibustered, let me just say a few words about my exposure to Musar. The truth is, I'm a classic example of child of immigrant family. My parents came from Poland in the 1920s, and again, it was a devout family. My father was the Talmud Chacham who taught Talmud every day. They didn't have the Daf Yomi in those days. They had groups that studied a bit of Talmud every single day. And he did it, and he was a brilliant child prodigy, really. But he loved Talmud, and in fact, I've said many times he was a classic Litvark. He hadn't the slightest clue as how you talk basketball or talk any daily activity with his children. He really didn't have that. I learned in his old age, when I got him to talk about himself, that he was an orphan. And from the age of 8, his mother was so poor she couldn't support him. And so she sent him away to yeshivot because they would, so at least supposedly, take care of the students. They didn't always get a meal every day, but so he grew up without a family experience. So again, he didn't have a clue as to how you relate to children in that way. But he had a great feeling of love. So how did he tell you make love? He would sit down and learn Gemara with you. And my sisters, not just with me. And of course, it infused a love of Gemara in my life that I never quite got over, which is, again, when someone makes love to you by teaching you a daf Gemara. Anyway, so that was also part of the history. But I was a classic modern Orthodox family. And the big challenge of that family was to become all-American. So that was my father's dream for me, and that's what he always pushed. And the truth is, a lot of my friends, the same background, that's why when they came to name their little Yitzchak at the bris, they didn't want to stigmatize me with a name like Yitzchak, which would be permanently immigrant greener. So they looked for the most white Anglo-Saxon Protestant name they could find, Irving. Okay, that's really, the truth is, my assimilationist period of my life until graduate school, I was Irving. My parents never called me Irving. They wouldn't know what is it. They called me Yitzchak. But in graduate school, after 2 years at Harvard, I came out. Of course, I went to Harvard because I wanted to be an American academic. That was the dream of being an American. But after 2 years, I had a Jewish infusion, and I came out of the closet as Yitzchak. And nobody in that bastion of Protestant America could pronounce it Yitzchak. Anyway, after about half a year, someone said Yitz, and that's how I became Yitzchak. Anyway, but to get back to this story, I was on my path. I went to Yeshiva University High School and Yeshiva University College. And then what happened? Well, my father, when he would teach Shas, he would go from a house on 49th Street and 13th Avenue to Bethel, the shul, the fancy upstairs shul, and downstairs as he taught Talmud in Yiddish. And halfway there was Yeshiva Beis Yosef. Yeshiva Beis Yosef was a refugee yeshiva. It was an offshoot of the Musar movement. There were 3 main school systems that grew out of Salanter's work. It was one of them. It was the radical extreme version of the movement. But it had about 40 students. Half of them had survived the camps, the concentration camps, and half of them had survived Siberia slave labor camps where the communists sent them when they fled Poland. So, they went through an incredible thing, and I must say, looking back, in Europe, they were considered a bit crazy. They were called by one group God's Cossacks. They were slightly crazy, but their main idea, their version of Musar was, you got to break your ego. And they tried very hard to break your ego. Anyway, but they made that a major piece of their educational system, spending time on working on yourself and your ego. Their problem,
this was the Navardic yeshiva. That was the
their problem. They never got over it. They really couldn't make up their mind whether they want to take in American boys. When you go through that kind of thing, when you work your whole life in this incredibly close way. So the truth is they were ambivalent. Unlike Rav Aaron Kotler, who went to Lakewood and said, this is going to be all American, or making American boys. We'll make European demands, but it's going to be American boys. They kind of couldn't do it. I was the second effort. They made one more after me, and they never really went at it wholeheartedly. And so in the end, they never really made it in the American system. But that day, my father went by, stopped off at the yeshiva. He used to do that regularly, and he would talk with the Rosh Yeshiva and say, we're thinking of taking in American boys. Would you know anybody who might be interested? Would be a good student. My father comes home and said, would you be interested? I said, I don't know. Is this a good school? You recommend it? He said, I don't know about Musar. That business, my father never went for Musar. Briska Soloveitchik never went for Musar. He said, but he's a Talmud Chacham, and I've spoken to him many times. I think you'll get a good shiur, so I would say it's worth considering. Fine. How are we going to consider it? So he said, look, we'll go one night. They has 3 Sidurim, morning, afternoon teaching, and in the evening people learn separate by themselves. He said, we'll go in the evening and we'll attend and see what it's like. It was very foolish. In the evening I couldn't hear a shiur, I couldn't know who, but we went. We sit down, so my father and I are sitting learning together for the whole time, and everybody else is learning. There's no formal presentation. What I didn't know was that before Ma'ariv, they do learning b'hispilus. This is in the book. Hispilus means you learn not just intellectually, but emotionally. Because one of the main points he made is that people are driven by emotions, by unconscious drives, by psychology, much more than by brain. And therefore, in addition to studying whatever you study regularly, they would have 15, 20 minutes before Ma'ariv. I'm sitting there learning with my father, and suddenly I realized that the whole room is quiet, and he and I are the only 2 voices. So I stopped. I look around, the room is dead silent. Suddenly at the table opposite me, this guy jumps up. One of the Talmidim jumps up, and he says, Hakina, kaivuvat, kavod, motzinas, olam and olam. You know, jealousy, the search for honor, and lust drives a person out of this world. And for the next 15 minutes, he chants it, he sings it, he dances it, he laughs it, he roars it, he bangs on the table. That's just him. But a minute later, the whole room explodes. In other words, 20 different people, not even with the same text. They're all, each got their own text. Some are crying, and some are laughing, and some are applauding. I'm sitting there, it was like I felt like a storm. It was overwhelming. It was like I was caught in a tsunami. I sat there 15 minutes stunned. And when they got through, I turned to my father and said, I'm going here. you know, it reminds you of it. And if you to that scene in Harry Meets Sally, when he hears, he hears the orgasm. He said, "I want that." You know. Anyway, I went there. I decided. So I went there. But you're laughing, but I went there, and the truth is, it was an overwhelming. It was an overwhelming experience. First of all, again, they're just unbelievable people. I mean, the kindness, patience, calm. I mean, again, I realize in retrospect, if I would have been in Siberia, one of the stories I heard about my Rebbe was that they tried to force him to go to work on, I forgot what Yom Tov it was, and he said no. And the guy threatened, go or else. So finally, the guy pulled out his gun and said, "You better go to work." And he stripped off his uniform, bearing his chest. He said, "Go ahead and shoot. I'm not going." I mean, so now when you learn to not be fazed and to stay calm. So again, I was just overwhelmed by their personal character and behavior, and I wanted to be like them. So for the next 4 years, that's what I did. And when I say I did, they learned, and of course they had good learning, and I appreciate it. But 3 examples of how they trained you. One is, there was a bi-weekly meeting with my Rebbe, who was a mashgiach, and he would sit there. It was like you would tell him your questions, your concerns, your personal struggles, and he would give you his diagnosis of what to do and what you're doing. And like in a regular 2 weeks, it was like a kind of a self-analysis session every 2 weeks. That was one example. The second example was they had a VAD. It was a committee. 5, 6 students get together. Again, they set their own spiritual, personal character. The whole idea is you have to work on your character to develop your personal and your behavior, your midos, what they called it, your qualities, so that you will not be jealous, you will not be competitive, you will not be selfish, and so on. So you pick what particular areas, you'll be ethical, you'll be responsible, and you would pick that and you would work on it. And they would meet regularly with you, the fellow students also working, and they tell you what they think they accomplished, and the group would then critique, take you apart. And then I would be my turn, and that was the second major activity that went on regularly. And the other activity, a book by a man named Mendel Leffin. He was actually he was a mascule, but a moderate one. He published a book in which he picked 13 personal human qualities, and you do it in a cycle, 1 week, 4 times a year. You go through all 13 personal qualities. And during that week, you work on it, you keep a diary, you notice what you did or haven't done. And again, you ask for your fellow students or other people to help you analyze and improve and correct your performance. So again, the truth is, I think there were experiences that didn't let me in all the way. So there may have been other activities that I wasn't fully exposed to, but what I was exposed to, and them, more or less, it really transformed my life. In one other way, I'll also mention, my transformed life, I mean, first of all, the religious experience was far more intense than I would have had in any modern Orthodox setting. I want to confess that. The second major version, they were obsessed, crazed by the idea of bringing Torah to the Jewish people. And in Europe before the war, they had 80 small yeshivas. When they got smicha, you would have to go out and organize a yeshiva ketana somewhere. They had 80 schools. Of course, they were wiped out by the Nazis when they came. But so they implanted this, and the truth is, my Americanization was still upper. So when I graduated, and I got smicha, I went to Harvard to become the American academic. But then a couple of years later, but I was torn. So I played back and forth. That's one of the reasons I went to YU, because when I got my PhD, because I thought at YU maybe I could do both. My secular studies, I was still an American historian. I wasn't a Jewish scholar. I was an American historian, but I figured it'll expose me to Jewish students and to their religious search. So I took that job, and then of course what happened is an encounter with the Holocaust when I visited a professor at Tel Aviv University. So I switched back to being the Jewish educator that Beis Yosef always wanted me to be. That's my background story.
And if you want more, it's one of the first chapters of the book if you want to see it in detail. Rabbi, thank you for sharing that. And I'll just pull out just some of the things. One is just to clarify the biographical pieces. This was, thinking about college, where he would go. Rabbi went to the Navardic Yeshiva and spent half his day each day, half going to college in America and half in the Navardic Yeshiva learning with this crowd. And a couple of the features of the Musar movement that he related to there was this idea of hispa'alus, the idea of developing a strategy to emotionally engage yourself in the kind of Jew you're trying to be. Today that might be considered listening to music or dancing or some other way to connect. We don't see as many people standing on chairs, unfortunately. Maybe that'll happen again. And this idea of working in a VOD, working with a group of people.
Justin proposed that tonight, instead of speaking, we should get you all up and
I was going to print out lines.
The truth is, 40 years ago I would have done that, but as I've gotten older, I've become more traditional.
Figure get everyone out of their chairs a couple minutes, but next time. And the idea of a VOD, the idea of being with a group of people, having both peers and a Rebbe who's talking you through what you're trying to accomplish in your Musar studies, and the idea of keeping some sort of spiritual journal where you're setting a goal for yourself. I want to work on my patience. I want to work on my loving kindness, chesed, and then taking notes on that over the course of the year. These are all features of Judaism that really go back to Rav Salanter, but have been developed since then and are kind of having an emergence as well today. What I want to transition to now, Rav Yitz, is just to share a little bit. There's the book and the ideas that come from the book. There's also the person, Rav Yisrael Salanter, and I know Rav Yitz himself kind of had his first understanding of Rav Salanter, and then in a very Rav Salanter way, decided that he should go back and read Rav Salanter through the psychology of Rav Salanter to get a different understanding of who he was. So why don't you share with us a little bit about your understanding, which is also laid out beautifully in the book, of who he was, what he was about, and kind of the big choices he made in his life and why.
Salanter, it's an interesting story because in my yeshiva, I didn't really appreciate him fully, although I did. They presented him in my yeshiva. As I said, they were an offshoot, and their founder was one of his more radical students, so they didn't spend a major piece of their work on Salanter. They did it more on the students' more radical approach. But they did expose me to the book, and they presented Salanter, and actually I want to recommend the book. It's called The Mudra Movement, by a man named Rav Dov Katz, which has a volume one, is a beautiful, it was translated into English, a beautiful full portrait of Salanta. They presented him as an example of a kind, warm, ideal, great Gadol rabbi. And again, many of these stories have become legendary. He was very kind and very considerate of people. And the famous story is that on one Yom Kippur, he was walking to shul for Kol Nidre, and he passed by this house. A little baby was crying. The mother was so anxious to get to Kol Nidre that she thought the baby was asleep, and she ran off to shul, and the baby actually woke up and was crying because no one was around to take care of him. So Salanta stopped and picked up the baby and handled it and so on. He never got to Kol Nidre, and when people went looking for him, they discovered that he's spending Kol Nidre the right way, taking care of a neglected orphan, not a neglected, but a baby child who needed care. Second story, which again, very white, became legendary. He was invited by one of his students, a very wealthy and very famous man who was famous for the fact that he would have these sumptuous meals and he'd invite great rabbis to speak and lecture and teach Torah at these meals. And he wouldn't come to him. And finally he begged him, he said, well, I'll come on condition you let me do it my way. So he agreed. He comes and his first thing he does is they go and they wash their hands. He tells them, you're pouring too much water, pour as little water as possible. What's the matter? He said, well, because the truth is they don't have running water here. The housemaid, she has to carry this water, so you'll have this great feeling of piety that you poured a lot of water, but it's on her back and she can't. So, and he rushed them through the whole meal, and of course at the end, he apologized to the housemaid. He called her and apologized. I rushed you. She said, Rabbi, thank God, most nights I sit here, I'm falling off my feet, I'm exhausted, I want to get, but I have to wait till the end of the meal. So God bless you. Third story, and perhaps the most important story of his life. In 1848, there was a cholera epidemic in Vilna. Terrible epidemic. Cholera is highly contagious. And on top of that, in the final stages of the disease, you get dysentery, you get diarrhea, and people die of dehydration typically. And it was a terrible plague, and Salanta called together the yeshiva students of Vilna and organized a kind of a medical peace corps, saying that they have to go around every day, check people and where they are in trouble to feed, bring water, take care of them, and so on. And every Friday before Shabbat, he called the group together and he gave them a special class on the importance of life-saving. They should not hesitate to do what they have to do and how this is the overriding mitzvah. Anyway, comes Yom Kippur that year, and the doctors told Salanta in their judgment, people are should not fast because it weakens you and it's a highly contagious disease. They should not fast, and what's more, they shouldn't spend a lot of time in shul because it's crowded and contagious. They should get out into the fresh air, and secondly, they should not fast. Well, he waited. He told them, he sent them to the chief rabbi and to the rabbis, they should come and talk to them. And of course, they did talk to them. And the truth is, when people privately would ask the rabbi, should I fast? They'd say, probably not. But they wouldn't put up a public notice. And Salanta was convinced that if they don't put up a public notice, a lot of people who will mean to be religiously observant will fast and they will die. So he waited and waited, nothing showed up. So on Erev Shabbos Shuvah, between Rosh Hashanah and Kippur, he posted notices throughout Vilna saying that the Torah says you're supposed to choose to live by this Torah. Life-saving is the whole thing. Therefore, in a medical opinion, one should not fast this year. Now, I understand why the other rabbis, who wants to go down in history as the rabbi who told his city everybody should eat on Yom Kippur. But of course, he understood because his religious values were central here. So he posted the notice. It was a tremendous controversy, and at least the version that I accept, on Yom Kippur, he got up into the great synagogue and said, we understand that many people are still trying to fast because they think they're doing the right thing, but the Torah, in fact, is telling you the right thing is that you save lives and you don't fast. And therefore he called, they brought in Kiddush, and he called upon people to make Kiddush and to break the fast. Again, it became famous and controversial and so on, but it was an expression, I think, of him. Now, more important, and that's within the book, of course, now, more important is that I came to see afterward that it wasn't just a matter of his human love for human beings, his understanding of Torah as something that God gives in order to make human life better and human society better. It was another, a deeper level. He saw that modernity was coming to Eastern Europe. He saw that the traditional community was not really prepared for it. And much of religious life was conformity. In fact, if you want to get a picture of it, I'd say look at Bnei Brak today. Meaning what? There's a tremendous emphasis on doing exactly and conformity. And if and if you change the stocking thickness, or if you, that's reform and it's not acceptable. And he felt that it was very vulnerable. As long as you had no choice, the authority of the rabbis would be unquestioned. But modernity would bring new issues, new economics, new social possibilities, new choices, and that they were totally unprepared. And so he came up with the idea of creating a movement. The first and foremost part of the movement is the Renaissance, deepening the religion from a set of practices to an internalized spiritual, ethical attitude toward life, toward people, toward society, that this was the most important thing to be done now. And he said, therefore, the yeshiva educational system has to change, and it has to spend a good deal of time not just on text or on observance or law, but on literally on working on your personality, character, and so on. So I came to see that not only was that a brilliant insight, but more important, it was his way of preparing the community for the challenge of choice, which has become, of course, the dominant challenge of Jewish life for the last 200 years. And that's that's what brought me back to him. The paradox that Justin referred to was that I saw him as they saw him as a very traditional figure. And then when I reconsidered, that's another whole conversation, I reread him in graduate school, and I reread him and I realized he spent the last 20 years of his life. Mind you, by then he had become one of the leading rabbis in Eastern Europe, and he was a masterful speaker and widely respected, honored, pleased, and so on. He gave all that up. He had students who took over the yeshiva and became very influential. He gave that all up. He spent the last 20 years of his life, he started in Königsberg in East Prussia, which is Germany, and then moved to Berlin and to Paris. He'd come back to visit Poland, Lithuania regularly, but he spent 80-90% of his time abroad in these settings. And I realized why, because he realized that Judaism has to adapt and deal with the reality of modern culture, modern choice. And he couldn't do that in Eastern Europe because they were so entrenched. They took the Haredi solution, which was try to keep it out, prohibited it, don't expose your students, don't have secular studies. And he felt the only future of the religion was to develop in a form where it could handle and be inspiring in a situation of choice and alternatives. So he spent those 20 years working in Western Europe with Western Jewish communities. To give one small example, it was prohibited and it made you treif if you'd go to university in those places. And he went to the university in Berlin and organized student circles. I guess this was a proto-Hillel, student circles. Then he suggested they should study Talmud. Then he commissioned somebody to translate Talmud into German so it should be available to these students. And his idea was, again, not just that they will study at the university level, but if they see Talmud at the university level, they'll realize that Jewish culture is something respectful and important in Western civilization, and therefore they are more likely to respect it. These are examples of what we try to do. The always keeps in mind why he spent it in Western Europe. One day he visited Hildesheimer, which was the other great rabbi. The two modern great Orthodox rabbis were Rav Samson Ferber Hirsch and Azriel Hildesheimer. Hildesheimer had a rabbinical seminary. As an extracurricular activity, he taught women Torah, which again was part of the modernization, because before modernity, women, sorry about that, didn't get educated, and certainly not in the Orthodox or religious community didn't study. So he set up classes for women, and Salanta visited one of those classes, and after the class, Hildesheim says, "What do you think?" He said, "You know something?" He said, "I wish I will have the share in Olam Haba, in the world to come, that you will get for these classes." And then he says to him, "But you know, if I would try to do this in Lithuania, they'd expel me. They would say I'm a heretic, I can't do it." So I say it's just interesting how he himself, in a sense, that was one of his big juggling acts, that he continued to visit and encourage the students, but he came to the realization that most of what had to be done couldn't be done. So anyway, so it's always fascinated me, partly because, as you might guess, my conclusion is that at the same set of issues, maybe some of the things he did then are now being done, but the unfinished job was, again, to develop a religious understanding of life that can literally make life more meaningful or more challenging or more purposeful or more fulfilling in a society where you can't force it and where it has to compete for importance, attraction, inspiration. And I think that's an unfinished job. So when Justin came back and said, "Let's translate this book and make it available," it occurred to me that that was the least I could do to at least make him available and relevant again, particularly because of the other thing that Justin said, maybe you'll talk about it now, which is that Justin on his own had discovered Musar and was convinced it could be revived and made available as a lay activity.
You want me to, okay, I'm happy to. First I'll just add to what Rav Yitz said, that the metaphor that Rav Salanter uses is the idea of horses running down a mountain. That it felt like in Eastern Europe, the horses were running down the mountain, and trying to turn the horses around was impossible. They didn't realize they were flying down the mountain. And then in Western Europe, the horses had got to the bottom. So there was an opportunity to think about, how do we get the horses back out up the mountain? That's the metaphor he used, which Rav Yitz just described. I'll speak briefly, Rav Yitz, thank you, kind of around thinking about Musar today. And so the way, the first way I thought about bringing it, so I learned Musar, I learned Alei Shor, which is a sefer written by Shlomo Volbe, a modern sefer about Musar. That's how I became interested. And I joined a VOD. I found Rabbi David Jaffe, people know him, became a mentor of mine and taught me Musar. And then I had the opportunity to bring it to a community. I worked at Ramaz for 3 years, around the same time that I was working on the Sefer with Rav Yitz. And what I found there was that we focus on, and Rav Yitz perhaps will mention this, that one of the core ideas of Rav Salanter was the idea that the Torah came to build a mensch. The Torah came to make a whole human. It's not just the lane of ritual Judaism, and it's not just the lane of, we should think more about Ben Adam L'Chavero. And so we have all these schools, such as Ramaz, that have in their mission statement in big letters, number one is to make mensches. That's what we're trying to do here. But then if you ask the faculty of a school, okay, so where does that happen? What class is the make mensches class? And they'll kind of assume it's supposed to, the parents do it, or the parents will say the school does it, or they'll say, you know what, if they have a nice math teacher, they'll learn it from their nice math teacher. But there's not necessarily, or we're learning Gemara, and that will make them a mensch. And so the idea that we pitched there was, could we actually dedicate time to trying to become mensches? And so how do we do that? That's the idea of Musar. Rav Salanter's kind of his big idea, or at least one of his big ideas, was to set goals for ourselves. In his case, the goal was, we will be judged at the end of our lives. How we behave will affect our portion in Olam Haba. And so we want to become the best version of ourselves so that we can go to Olam Haba on good terms, let's say. How do we do that? Clarify the challenges we're facing. So some of his challenges were the idea of desire was a big challenge. Another challenge was the idea of falling into routine that Rav Yitz mentioned, that we kind of become routine, so we're not focusing anymore. And a third was bias. This idea that he discovered the subconscious, or we don't know if he discovered, but he parallel was working on the idea of unconscious and subconscious, and the idea of we can tell ourselves stories to convince ourselves things. So clarifying some of the challenges, and then clarifying how we're going to get there. So Rav Yitz mentioned before, laying out 13 character traits you want to work on in a given year is one example. Or saying to ourselves, I really noticed that I'm not a patient person. In my mind, I know the right thing to do is to be patient. How do I get there? Can I develop some way to do that? And so, one way is to stand on a table and chant things about being more patient. There are many others which we could discuss in detail afterwards. But so the idea here was, can we come up with some sort of curriculum that clarifies the goal, clarifies the challenges and sets out a path to get there. And what was beautiful for me going to that moment was I had this amazing thing happening where I was studying Musar, which was really helped me focus on how to get there. But not necessarily everyone, their goal is the same as Rav Salanter, especially today, to think about, my goal is to live my life in a way for Olam Haba. But at that time, I had just encountered Rav Yitz. And someone who was like, knew the Torah was good for me, and then I wanted to be a good person, suddenly I had this whole beautiful theology, right? I had covenantal theology, the idea of Tzelem Elokim, all these amazing ideas that Rav Yitz had introduced to the world. And so suddenly I was able at Ramaz to pair those two together, to lay out, the goal is treat people b'tzelem Elokim. The goal is to be partners with Hashem to bring us closer to that moment of redemption. And we have a whole practice, a way where you can set up, the same way you might learn piano, you can learn how to be more patient, how to treat people with Tzelem Elokim. And so I introduced the curriculum there for parents, faculty, and students as a way to create common language and common practices to do that work. And I'll pause there just because of time, and I'm happy to talk about that more afterwards. Or I guess I'm going to turn it back to you now, and I'm going to ask you, I think this is probably, we're getting near the end of our time here, is just, without going into the text, which I encourage everyone to look at carefully, from 10,000 feet, if you were to kind of lay out, let's say, what are the three core ideas that Rav Salanter was putting forward? I'll give you 4 or 5 if you want. What were the key things? We were just discussing before that we're living in an era that people don't always have the patience to read books. So give us a little bit of the highlights. What was Rav Salanter's intellectual contributions? What were the things he was pushing for here?
It's so hard to make choices here, but let me start. In 1843, after a couple of years in Vilna, he put out a letter called the Letter on Musar, Igerda Musar, why there's a need for a movement. And it starts with a very powerful, it's in the book, in the translation too. It opens with these lines: the human being is free, or is totally free, in their imagination and their emotions, but is restrained by reason. And this tension between unconscious drives, lust, desire, instincts, and on the other hand, my reason, it tells me this is wrong and this is right. Don't do this because it's wrong. Or it tells me you can't do all this thing, you have to make some choices and you have to be more responsible, etc. That tension in every human being between the emotional drives, the irrational drives, the unconscious needs, and the reason and judgment that lead us to do the right thing, racks people. And they need help, first of all, in the tradition he feels, but they need help to reconcile the two, to gain a mastery over your emotions, to develop a religious understanding that is able to channel those emotions in a more constructive way. That's the first reason, and you can't do this alone. He comes back with the point. That's why you need a movement, you need a community, you need a school, you need teachers and friends that will work on it with you. I think that's an exceptionally important idea, and of course, by the side, he himself discovered what was being discovered in the early 20th century, the role of the unconscious and of psychology in dominating. Kahneman just died. I mean, the psychology dominates most of our consumer choices rather than reason, but how do you reconcile and how do you make it more efficient? The second thing that he mentioned in there, and again I think was a very important part of his understanding, was that he felt that in Lithuania we've achieved an extremely high level of faithfulness and careful observance of ritual. He said, like in kosher, he said, not only are people absolutely careful of kosher, but he said even the butchers, even if a question comes up and if there's a question of the kashrut, they won't even ask the question, they'll just throw out the thing, even though it's very expensive and hard for them to do, because they absolutely understand you must have perfect standard. He said, but in business, in the growing economy, and of course modernity is coming, it's becoming a much more dynamic economy. He said people, even the most devout, feel very comfortable in cutting corners and doing things that are outright prohibited by the Torah and so on. And therefore he felt it's a very important moment where the religion, as I came to see, in part to meet the competition, but where the religion has to restore the balance, where people understand religion is not a matter of just behaviors. It's a matter of a total personal worldview. It's a total character. And therefore, it has to restore the balance of ethical and ritual so that a truly religious person has the same high standards in ethics as they do in ritual. And again, it's not something that he has a wonderful pun. There's a daily prayer that in the Tachanun that says David was given a choice by the prophet. He did a great sin, and the prophet said, I'll give you two choices. Either you let God send a punishment on you, a plague, or a human enemy conqueror will come and attack your people, and you'll fight him, or but you'll struggle. He said, which one? So David's comment is, well, I'd rather fall into God's hands, because God is full of mercy, than in the human hands. Slanta did a pun on that. He said, if I'm going to fall, if I'm going to sin, let it be against God, because God has great mercy and forgiveness, and because God is not of God's back, if you sin, it's not going to hurt God. But do not fall into the human side, because humans will suffer, humans will be angry. So that whole restoration of a whole religious view, I think, is really a major contribution. And one could go on and on. The other thing is, this movement, he felt it was important that the movement reach out to lay people. In a sense, paradox, his greatest success was in Eastern Europe, where his students took over the yeshiva world and in many ways taught his Torah. But in a way, it was a tragedy. Not a tragedy, but a setback for him, because he understood in the New World that the power would come not from on high, from the rabbis in God's name, and no one questions that they take their authority for granted, but the authority would come from the consensus and the acceptance of the lay people. So his great dream was to create a kind of a lay movement where this would be accomplished, where the religion would become internalized and understood. But of course, as I said, he never quite succeeded there, but I think it's a very, very important idea.
Beautiful. So, and I'll just add briefly, Rav Yitz gave the example of comparing the mitzvot with other people versus the mitzvot with God, and how we can learn from one and the other. I think on the flip side of that, another idea that he introduced was the idea of thinking about the amount of economy we put into strategy in our lives. If you think today, I mentioned piano lessons, how much time and money we might spend getting good at piano or tennis or preparing for that next meeting or having some program at work or a business plan, right? The amount of time and money we spend on perfecting things, and you might spend hours preparing a meal for your family, or hours deciding where to order from on Uber in America. But do we spend even 30 seconds thinking about how we're going to be at that meal? That we're going to be seeing our family for the first time that day. We're going to be sitting with our kids. What are the questions? Do we want to lead with this question or just say whatever's on our mind? And so I think he encourages us to think about using the same what he called chokhmat ha'olam, the wisdom of the world. Can we use the same wisdom we use to approach all other areas of our life as we do with our relationships? And I think, if you look at the Harvard study, the longitudinal study of adults, our healthy relationships are kind of the key to happiness. And so shifting our mindset to be strategic, to develop practices and strategies to try to have healthier relationships, I think he was onto something. And then I'll just say, I think we're going to close, Rav Yitz. I'll just say from where I'm sitting, certainly, going to Rav Yitzhak Blue's home 2 days a week for several years was one of the most amazing schools of my life. Really, really very, very special. Not just the learning, the seeing how they run a home and the way they interact. I remember the day Blue got Rav Yitzhak the wrong shirts and how he navigated that. And I learned how to have that conversation with my wife. And I remember once we were in a car and we had a fender bender also, and the way he navigated that. Those small things, seeing how he interacted with people, was certainly my major learning. And then I'll just say, I think, I'm not a psychoanalysis person here, but I think in terms of thinking about Rav Yitz and Rav Salanter, Rav Salanter was someone who was so far ahead of his time and right about so many things, and it just kind of took the world some time to catch up and realize all of them. And I think, Rav Yitz is also someone who's so far ahead of his time, and I think has spoken about sometimes the challenge of being 10 or 20 or 30% ahead of the community, and the importance of sometimes coming up with, as little as being 0.5% ahead of the community to try to guide them forward. And so I think he sees a bit of of a kindred spirit in Rav Salanter, if I can project that onto him. And I think, we're celebrating one book today, which is so important and hopefully will contribute to the world of Musar. But I also, we have, God willing, in a couple months, Rav Yitz's masterpiece, Triumph of Life, coming out. And I think that'll also be an example of something that is not only so important for today, but something that people will be reading for centuries, millennia ahead, and looking back and realizing how far ahead of his time Rav Yitz is. And so
I'll just
you're
add a
cutting me off?
comment.
Okay.
He's just let out the secret, of course, is Blue Greenberg. He let that secret out too. but of course, beyond that, again, I just want to say that I think really the people living through really the heroic age of the Jewish people. It's really coming back from the Shoah and being swamped with death. So we choose life. And I love this book in part because he understood that the community has to really, on many levels, has to restore its ethical strength. Another example, it's in the book, it's first time translated. Part of the book has been translated, but it has an essay to create a kollel. Because in the old days, he said, people became great scholars or decisors because their parents, that was their whole thing, they had to live on, and their parents would support them and make sure they do it. But that's all gone, he said, so you have to have institutions. So he came up with the idea of strengthening the yeshiva, making them much better organized, and take care of the students, and more efficient, give exams, things so they should function. There's a lot of wasted time, so he came up with the idea of institutional growth, a Beit HaMusar, creating a special place where people could go a couple hours to sit and study and analyze character. In other words, just like shul is a place to daven, his was a place where you would self-analyze. So again, he had just a lot of vision and a lot of understanding that in order to do what we're talking about, we need institutional development, we need new methods, we need new streams of inspiration, and in many ways, Musar is like Hasidut in its time and like Kabbalistic in its time to restore common purpose, inspiration, and common cause for the Jewish people. And as I say, this is the moment, in my judgment, where the Jewish people, and now of course with the crisis in Israel on top of that, it's when it's being tested at its limit. And Salanter's answer was that the people has the depth. You just have to help them. You have to bring it out. And you have to sustain them. They have to sustain each other. But together, he felt that we had the opportunity to renew Judaism and to renew the community and its people and to meet the challenge of choice. Thank you.